I will switch over immediately and hand over to Olaf Storbeck for the first panel on, as I said, fiscal fraud and financial regulation and financial fraud. And you may present the panel. Olaf Storbeck is from the Financial Times and has been implicated in, let's say, some of these fiscal financial frauds, and we will maybe talk about this later. Olaf, please.
Yes, good morning. I hope I wasn't implicated, but I was kind of covering it. Yeah, thank you so much. When you asked me a few weeks back if I was willing to moderate this panel, I immediately agreed after seeing who was on the panel. And I'm really glad to be able to welcome Martin Hellwig, the former director of the Bonn Max Planck Institute, and I think one of the most important and best economists in the German-speaking and also the European hemisphere. Then we have Wolfgang Schick, the former Green MP, who is now the head of Finance Watch Germany, and I'm still slightly angry with him for having left German Parliament, because I think he was one of the best finance savvy MPs in Parliament. As discussants, we have Jörg Kukies, former Goldman Sachs banker and now Germany's deputy finance minister, and Daniela Gabor, an academic from the University of the West of England in Bristol, who is covering or who's working on fraud and financial crime and the financial sector. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this session. And Martin, I think the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can I share the screen, or is this done centrally?
Not quite sure if I'm supposed to do it. It's a good question, actually. I think I am just dialed in as a normal participant.
Yes, you can. I've tried it earlier. You can. Just click on the share screen in the middle.
Does this work? Can you see the screen?
No, at the moment we only see you. Let me see. I think it's just below the in the middle.
Yeah, I did switch on the share screen.
Okay, maybe. Oh, now it's working. Now we have your screen.
Now you have it. Okay.
Yeah.
Fine. So thank you for the opportunity. Let me begin by making a remark to the effect that while we're all worked up about the Wirecard scandal, we have to avoid the temptation to use scandal as a measure of importance. The important feature about German financial supervision is that it hasn't worked all along, except its failures in the financial crisis have been too complicated for public discussion to get heated up about it. This is why I want to go back to the financial crisis. Incidentally, the presentation between Gerhard and me will be shared. So I'll talk about the crisis and he'll talk about the reform. The crisis was very expensive. There has been no cleanup afterwards, and we still are not back in a position of stability. In terms of supervision, some institutional detail. BaFin was created in 2002 through a merger of previously separate supervisors. One purpose of the creation was to avoid supervision coming under the sole control of the Bundesbank and indirectly the ECB. Supervision is carried out in cooperation with the Bundesbank, and BaFin is under orders from the Finance Ministry. It's not an independent institution. Causes of the financial crisis and the fallout for Germany: a lack of equity, in particular through an abuse of special purpose vehicles, excessive maturity transformation, in particular involving a lot of wholesale funding and involving the SPVs. Hypo Real Estate was a prime example, but Deutsche Bank was not so bad as well. And if you think about toxic investments, whatever you name, German banks were there. Mortgage-backed securities, real estate bubbles, cross-border Eurozone lending, shipping loans, government loans. And on the side of both the institutions and the supervisor, there were illusions about risks and there was manipulation of risk-adjusted regulation. Risk weights did not mean what they were supposed to mean. What did the supervisor do? Well, the Greens have succeeded after 7 years, including a constitutional court judgment, to get information about that from the government. And one answer is nothing. Even though they had a right to speak out, they didn't use that. The supervisor didn't question risk strategies and risks for all the topics that I've mentioned. And it's also clear they didn't understand anything about systemic risk and correlations, or they didn't care. Why? A combination of comity and friendship with the supervisees. As explained in the proceedings before the Constitutional Court, friendship with the supervisees is important if you want to get the information from them. I think that was reinforced by the sharing of responsibility with the Bundesbank. Some sense of banks having more competence in risk modeling and assessment, certainly justified, but without any attention to incentives. Finally, legalisms, in particular in dealing with the SPVs. A short-term money market funding that's used to hold long-term assets and is supported by a guarantee from the bank is allowed because such guarantees are problematic only if they have a maturity of more than 365 days. The fact that the asset financed has a longer maturity didn't matter. Subordination to the Finance Ministry. One of Mr. Kukies' predecessors actually had an article in 2006 saying that securitization and special purpose vehicles are the way of the future, and German institutions will be part of this, and we will not prevent that. Subordination to the Finance Ministry. Politics has brought 3 dimensions to this. One, a promotion of national champions. Second, the politics of public banks, which effectively serve at parafiscal institutions at the local and regional levels. And in order to assess that, you have to appreciate that the heads of the regional governments play a major role in federal politics, federal legislation. Finally, the fact that there were no bail-ins has to do with the protection of politically well-connected debt holders. If you look at Hypo Real Estate, it wasn't just Deutsche Bank and Allianz, but also the churches, public television, municipalities, and I could go on. Stop about the economics, except to say the Landesbanken were never very profitable. And the EU in 2001 said, in an agreement with the German government, state guarantees are illegal state aid and need to be stopped. So there was an agreement to abolish them, but that was delayed for 4 years. And during these 4 years, the Landesbanken picked up some 250 billion euros worth of state guaranteed funding. one may say the MBS bubble in the US was to a significant part funded by the Landesbanken. So most losses were in the crisis were with the Landesbanken. The covered bond sector was also hard hit. The government provided bailouts for all and very little exit. In the case of VIII, the exit was forced by the European Commission. The political system, no investigation of why German institutions were hard hit, no investigation of the role played by supervision. The crisis was produced in the US, that's a quote from the previous finance minister, Mr. Steinbrück, first by the production of toxic assets, then by letting Lehman Brothers fail, resistance to any tightening of regulation, resistance to any exit and any bail-in. BaFin was part of the game, in particular with forbearance on NPL accounting. An example is a special investigation in 2013 of shipping loans, which didn't really recognize the shipping crisis. Why? Banking is political. I'm repeating myself from what I said before. And BaFin is subordinated to the political system. There also is a lack of competence in the assessment of innovative activities and internal models, a lack of competitiveness in markets for qualified personnel, an awe of people whose position in the industry suggests that they did have the competence, and a fear of complaints in Berlin. And with that, I hand over to Gerhard Schick.
Martin, if you unshare your, yeah, that's perfect.
Please keep sharing, because I don't have a...
No, we can...
You share it?
Yes.
Okay.
So you can take the...
Gerhard?
Perfect, yeah. So thank you very much. Good morning. And I take over from Martin Hellwig. Continuing with the current situation following the Wirecard scandal. Not without saying that in between 2008 and 2020, when the Wirecard scandal broke out, there have been a series of important financial scandals in Germany. It is to mention, Martin Hellwig already said some words about it, the Cum-Ex scandal, a huge tax fraud, where now attorneys investigate over 1,000 people inflicted in that scandal. So really a massive participation of financial sector experts in a huge tax fraud scheme. There too, BaFin was passive and really didn't care about it, saying that was tax issues and not seeing that it was a huge financial fraud scheme in financial markets where they were also responsible to combat that. There have been several fraud schemes in the capital markets in Germany. The latest one, P&R, being an enterprise which sold ship participations, but the ships were not all there. So it was similar to Wirecard, a fraud scheme where in the balance sheet positions appeared that didn't exist in reality. All these scandals produced an outcry only in limited expert circles, although they reach billions in cost either to the taxpayer or to investors, private investors. There have been minor changes following each scandal in legislation, and of course a push for better supervision, but all over those years you could not observe any paradigm change. All these scandals didn't leave really an important mark on the way BaFin worked. Well, the same happened in the beginning of Wirecard. The typical reaction of the German political establishment could be seen as in the previous cases, a drastic wording describing fraud and how bad it is, commissioning a study, covering up, saying, well, all the German institutions basically have done a good job, but even so it happened. and there was nobody taking responsibility, not the finance minister responsible for financial supervision, not the economic minister responsible for the auditing sector, not one of the three heads of government institutions among these BaFin who would have been responsible for impeding such a scandal to develop or to go unnoticed as long a time. We switch to the next chart. I do that. Oh, sorry. Thank you. But then there are differences. So there might be a chance for a paradigm change. Parliamentarians pushed for a parliamentary probe and did a really good job to investigate and made cover-up impossible. They uncovered lobbyism, insider deals, and a breaking of rules by government institutions that made it impossible for the government to limit itself to the first reaction. The clear case of criminal behavior made it impossible to say that this was okay. It allowed for a public discussion. As Martin Hellwig said, in the financial crisis, the issues like special purpose vehicles, etc., were complex. In this case, fraud, that was something everybody could understand. So there was broad media coverage. Civil society organizations reminded of past scandals where there was no adequate reaction. And not least to mention there are federal elections in sight in September, so there was a certain need to do something. What the parliamentarians discovered was that the basic mindset in BaFin, the financial supervisor, but apparently also in other institutions was, we have to protect our financial markets against outsiders like hedge funds, short sellers, or the Financial Times and other investigative journalists. An interesting narrative for a supervising authority, which should rather have the paradigm of saying we're the supervisor and we control financial markets. As a consequence of the parliamentary probe, the heads of the three responsible government agencies had to step down. Whereas in the beginning of the scandal, they all said they had done what was necessary to do, they later had to admit of either breaking the rules, doing trading with Wirecard shares at a time where the scandal was already visible, and or allowing for their staff to trade in Wirecard shares or other assets linked to Wirecard. So they had to step down, making way for a new beginning. Another question is, will this lead to a new paradigm for supervision in Germany? Will this lead to a new paradigm for the auditing sector and lead to new rules for auditing companies who have also made it impossible to change the rules? I remind you of the initiative of Michel Barnier in 2010 to change the rules for auditing in Europe. But against the Big Four and their lobbyism, it was impossible to change those rules. But I will not focus on the auditing sector, but focus on the new paradigm for financial supervision. What would be necessary is moving from cuddling with the industry to law enforcement. Would be necessary to provide sufficient funding and career patterns to allow for building up of competence in the supervisory authorities, eliminate the division of tasks between BaFin and Bundesbank, and also create transparency about the relations to the ministry and make BaFin more independent, more accountable to the German public. What can we observe? The current reforms are more thorough than what we have observed in past scandals. The three goals that the government mentions are making supervisory and auditing activities more effective, streamlining internal structures and procedures, allocating responsibilities more clearly, supervising the financial market more effectively with state-of-the-art technology. And there is also mentioning of a fundamental change in culture, which remains rather unclear what that is supposed to mean. The three goals that the government mentions are basically saying we keep the same paradigm, but we want to work better, which is always a good thing to do. But Martin Hellwig and we agree that there is the need for real paradigm change. There are some changes in the in legislation that give BaFin more rights to intervene. But the question is it sufficient for an institution who so far hasn't used the rights that it already had to do a good job? There are more possibilities for BaFin to perform controls, also mystery shopping, for example, when it comes to protection of consumers. So far, they haven't used their means, so more possibilities for them is a good idea, but will it be sufficient? And there is a ban on private trading in financial instruments for BaFin employees, which I would say is done years ago. It's not the huge paradigm change, it's just something that a good government institutions should have. So the question is, will that be a new paradigm? We think the current reforms fall short of leading to a new paradigm. There is talk about a supervision with more bite, but we cannot really observe a clear distancing from previous cuddling. And as long as that is not admitted, that there has been a wrong way of doing supervision by cuddling too much with the industry, it is not really credible that the more bite will lead to a paradigm change. We do not see a relevant strengthening of consumer protection, one of the core weaknesses of BaFin. And the problematic interface between BaFin and the Finance Ministry, there is no change there. And we also see no change in the public accountability of the supervisor. The idea would be that BaFin communicates more what do we do for the citizens, for example, like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in the United States or the Financial Conduct Authority in the United Kingdom. And last but not least, the financial lobby sits still in the BaFin board. So there are structural things that would need to be changed in order to lead to a new paradigm that brings more distance from the industry and makes sure that BaFin really does the job of a good financial supervisor. Thank you for your attention, and we're happy to hear the referees and to discuss these issues with you.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was quite a rebuke of German financial supervision and regulation, not only in the Wirecard scandal, but well, at least starting from before the financial crisis. I'm really keen to hear what Jörg is going to say in his defense, or also in the defense of his kind of predecessors. I don't think this was only messed up over the last 4 years since you've been in government. So yeah, let me maybe start with Jörg and then we go to Daniela, because I think you are kind of entitled to share your view of this first, maybe. Thanks.
Sure. Many thanks, and many thanks for giving me the opportunity for the discussion here, because I think it's extremely important, and I definitely will not make the attempt to justify everything and to be defensive about it, because I think many of the points that have been raised are absolutely justifiable, and that the extensive discussion, which needless to say has been enormously painful for us, has been at the end of the day extremely healthy, because it has helped us to gain public support for a lot of the reforms that we're now doing. And I think one of the points that I always make in response to Gerhard and Martin's points is that what we're doing at the moment is only a beginning, not an end. We do face the institutional difficulty of a nearing end of the legislative period, so that we very consciously made a decision what we think is doable in this legislative period and what we need to move to the next legislative period. And I think some of the issues that Martin and Gerhard have raised, namely independence of BaFin, separation of tasks between Bundesbank and BaFin, so essentially the regulatory triangle between the Finance Ministry, the Bundesbank, and the BaFin deserve much more thorough investigation, because I think it's not as simple as saying an independent supervisory body is unambiguously good and a supervisory body subject to supervision by the finance ministry is unambiguously bad. Otherwise, I wouldn't be reading about financial scandals in the US and the UK very regularly. So I think that topic does deserve very deep analysis. I still remember in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, also the SEC was heavily criticized, and the FCA was heavily criticized, and we've had financial scandals in the UK, as Olaf and his paper also regularly report. So I think I'm not saying our system is right and the other one is wrong. I'm just saying the question of what responsibility does the supervisory body have to the public, and how do you enforce that responsibility? Is it by the German system of a reporting responsibility to the ministry and through the ministry to parliament, or is it an independent agency? I think that's a quite complex question. And I simply am saying these questions are so deep that we didn't think that in the time that we had in this legislative period, we would find the sufficient depth of answers. So that's up to the new government to decide, and there's a lot of statements already in the public. So at the end of the day, voters will have the ability to influence that decision by their vote for parliament. However, I would want to make a few statements on what's been said and explain a little bit about our role, both in the financial scandal, where I can say much less because I simply wasn't in the public sector at the time, but of course also in the Wirecard scandal. And Martin Hellwig has many times stated the BaFin is under orders of the finance ministry. Gerhard Schick has talked about the problematic interface between BaFin and the finance ministry. Now, what I think is interesting in the Wirecard scandal is that we've witnessed two diametrically opposing stories. At the beginning, the criticism was exactly this: the massive influence that the finance ministry was alleged to have over BaFin in the Wirecard case. One opposition politician in the podcast said the finance minister was the component of the music. I was the director, and Felix Hufeld was the chief violinist, or the first violinist. I don't know the technical terms in opera. I could tell them to you in German, but the problem with that story is we provided 1 million pages of documents. The parliamentarians had full access to all documents by BaFin, by Wirecard, by the finance ministry, everything. And they completely changed their story. The story initially was one of massive influence over the finance ministry to the BaFin. Then they found out that this massive influence simply didn't take place. And then they changed the story and said, oh, you were way too passive and you didn't do enough. So I think those stories are completely diametrically opposing each other. But one of the things that I can definitely say is this claim that there was massive influence of the finance ministry over BaFin definitely didn't turn out to be true in many, many hours of testimony, in many different sources of testimony. I think that I can say for sure that this massive influence, or the BaFin being under the orders of the finance ministries, definitely didn't take place. Now, of course, you can then say it's also a legitimate criticism to say the finance ministry should have done more, but you have to understand we are constantly in this dilemma of, on the one side, under German and European legislation, the operational independence of BaFin, which is also enshrined in German legislation, that we are not meant to intervene and interfere in individual case-by-case decision-making by BaFin, but are meant to draw the general lines and to make sure that BaFin has the correct authorities and the correct means to enforce its supervision. But On the other side, and that is in many individual cases also enshrined in European law, we have to respect the operational independence of BaFin, while also maintaining, of course, our by German law mandated role of oversight over BaFin. So I think that's a dilemma, and I completely agree that that creates conflicts. But it's not, as I said, a complete unambiguously, this German system that we have leads to unambiguously worse results than others. What are we doing to address? Yes?
I interrupt you because I think if you could come to an end so we can have a discussion and we can
okay, yeah, it's, I mean,
have a discussion.
Okay, I'll try to wrap it up, but just so much has been said. I apologize, but it's as you can imagine. So the other point that I would argue is we did respond quite quickly. The statement that Gerhard Schick made that there was a classic response and that we first denied all responsibility. At least you have to acknowledge that the first draft of our action plan that led to the current legislative results was published 4 days after. No, sorry, it wasn't published, but it was drafted 4 days after the insolvency of Wirecard. That is now public because we revealed it to the inquiry committee. So in that sense, I would say we did at least make the effort of taking action quickly and also implementing reforms quickly. We also didn't limit the reforms only to the Wirecard scandal implications. I think the question of culture change at BaFin is a totally legitimate one, and it has to be implemented. We're doing all we can, including the personnel changes that you spoke about, including more authority to BaFin, but we're not stopping at that. You mentioned correctly the PNR scandal. My colleague and friend Gerd Billen and I presented a plan for enhancing consumer rights for these scandalous selling practices of closed-ended participation rights that have led to many, many destructions of billions and billions of euros of savers' money. In 2019, we managed to get it through cabinet in 2020, and the final legislation is now being passed. That will include a complete prohibition of blind pools, that will include a mandatory supervision of the selling practices, a professionalization of the selling practices of all of these products. So I do think that we're taking the consequences there quite substantially. Mystery shopping is something you named. I'm particularly proud that we implemented that because there was massive resistance against that for many, many years, as you know. So in that sense, I think we're doing what we can, but of course, we won't have finished the reforms by the end of this legislative period, as I said.
Okay, thank you very much. Daniela, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just try to share my screen and start with a disclaimer. I am not an expert in financial fraud, I'm afraid. Neither am I an expert in the intricacies of the relationship between BaFin and the Ministry of Finance in Germany. However, I want to pick up something that Gerhard has sort of emphasized over and over again, and I think it's quite important, which is the question of the German authorities cuddling of private finance. And I want to set that question in sort of in a bigger picture and to ask two questions and to try to address them. And the first one is, why is the national champions of this cuddling of private finance, why is this narrative so powerful and so politically influential, both in German and European macrofinance? I don't think this is a distinctively German problem or challenge. I think it goes way beyond that in almost every other large European capital. And the second question that I want to address is, why does it matter looking forward beyond the sort of questions of how do we reform the specific German sort of institutional arrangement, and to think in terms of paradigms change in relationship to decarbonizing finance, because I think the question of national champions related to climate change and the climate crisis is very important. And let me just do the slideshow. So just to remind ourselves that the question of national champions is very powerful, or it's very influential in Germany. This is not just about Wirecard, but an example of Deutsche Bank that has received many penalties for misbehavior, but still last year, we had conversations about German politicians trying to push for a merger in order to protect or to transform it into a national champion again. And the question that I have been thinking about for a while, and related to the presentation that Martin and Gerhard just went through, is why is it so powerful? Why almost 12 years after the global financial crisis, do we still talk about national champions in European and in German finance? And I think there are sort of three accounts or three explanations of why this is the case. The first one, and I would really like to hear more about this in the conversation, I think Gerhard addressed it, is that there is a political reluctance to challenge the rules of the game that are set by US-led financial globalization. And this is the system we live in. It's a financially globalized world. And the sense in Europe always has been that we are second fiddle. We are worried about US hedge funds. And the idea is you just have to play the game better. You can't change it. You just have to play the game better. So you have to cuddle a set of private financial operators so they can compete with US finance. And I want to remind ourselves also that this US-led financial globalization is moving very fast and is changing very fast. And I think this raises new challenges that go beyond simply the institutional reconfigurations at national level. I just want to mention here that we are no longer that much worried about global banks because we have regulated them and their global banking glut, and Hyung-Soo Shin was talking about is in a sense addressed, but now we have a portfolio glut because asset managers are global and increasingly important. And I just want to mention here one aspect which has to do a lot with some of the conversations we just had, which is the presence of US private equity funds and companies in European residential housing, which has become a question of consumer protection, I think, also to a certain extent. And here is a graph that sort of points to how important here, again, US asset managers are, and how this question of national champions is going to come back to haunt us as global finance changes. And asset management in Germany is not that powerful. It's in the sense it can't really compete that successfully, I think, without proper cuddling. So I would like to ask Gerhard to reflect more on how do we change the logic, the structural logic of cuddling private finance when private finance changes very rapidly and is dominated by US companies. And I just want to remind ourselves that this is not, that we have had attempts, sometimes led by Germany, to reverse the narrative of national champions and to change the rules of the game that have given us this powerful narrative. The European Financial Transactions Tax, the Bank Structural Reform Directive that was buried by the European Commission a couple of years ago. Here I have a very interesting article from the Finance Watch if you want to read it. And I think we need to bear in mind that for paradigm change is not enough to get the German Ministry of Finance or the BaFin to sit together and cooperate better. The question of how finance is hardwired into monetary and fiscal policy is much more complicated and difficult to resolve politically. And the examples that I'm giving here have seen resistance, for example, from the ECB to structural reform because it impacts their ability to implement, in their view, it impacts their ability to implement monetary policy. So I think we need to push that conversation of paradigm change beyond simply financial regulation and into the broader macro financial institutions that we have at European level and that interact. And I'm going to finish in a second, Olaf, just to get the conversation going. Why I think this matters is if we look forward, we are looking at a very substantive challenge of decarbonizing finance, both for German financial system, but for the European financial system as well. And I would suppose globally, because climate crisis is a global problem. And I think the narrative of national champions is influencing to a significant extent the way in which the policies around decarbonizing finance have been designed. First, in terms of who defines what sustainable lending and sustainable assets are, what we are seeing is that increasingly European regulators, and I would add German regulators, are willing to surrender taxonomies of what is green lending and dirty lending to private finance. And again, you have a cuddling of green finance there, if you want. And it's not just about taxonomies, but the policies to decarbonize finance, I think, will end up with a promotion of green national champions, which probably, I would argue, will mean subsidized greenwashing on a significant scale. I will conclude with saying that national finance champions, I think, are often at odds with the public good, and I think there are various examples in Germany of why this is the case, because they reinforce rather than activate or for a substantive reform of the governance of private finance. And to my mind, this is even more inconsistent when we think about the decarbonization of European finance. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thanks a lot, Daniela. I think if we have questions from the audience, the best thing would be to post them in the chat box, which you find in the middle of below the screen. I would like to start with a question to Martin and Gerhard, which Jörg mentioned and which I also had on my list. I mean, I do share most of the criticism personally, but I think there still is a fundamental question to the core of your argument, which is basically the financial crisis wasn't kind of an event which was isolated on Germany. It was not even triggered, I think one could argue, by German events. Other countries also had their fair share in other corporate fraud scandals where the regulators didn't really cover themselves in glory. Also the Cum-Ex scandal, which you mentioned, wasn't a purely German event, but also happened in other European countries. So, what's your kind of why do you focus on Germany in this regard, and what's your kind of response to that criticism, which I think is a valid one?
And it's very simple. Some of the features that we're talking about are not just German, but are, in a sense, continental European, or some might even say Southern European. Even though the Bundesbank is north of the River Main, there are some southern features of German governance. If you compare to other countries, one question to ask is, why was France different? France was not much affected by the crisis. There were individual problems at Société Générale and at BNP Paribas, but the costs of the crisis to France were much smaller. And that has to do with the difference in the internal politics. May I add a response to both Jörg Kukies and Daniela Gabor on that account? First, on to Jörg Kukies, influence of the political system doesn't always require explicit orders. It's enough to have an informal interaction where the supervisor anticipates what's expected. And if you think about the Asmussen paper from 2006, that made clear what was expected. If you also think about the Landesbanken, and this is now a response to Daniela, Daniela, it's not just macro, it's fiscal and political. For the head of a German regional government, the power to move a few millions by just one phone call, without accountability to a parliamentary committee or the public, is worth every cent of taxpayer money. And it's this interconnectedness between politics and the financial sector which we have to see at the background. And I agree with Jörg Kukies that it's very difficult to reform this, and that merely independence won't do the job, but that's at the back of why the costs of the financial system are so high.
If I may, I would add just the two points. What is different perhaps in Germany to other countries is that the sanctions that the supervisory authority imposes are so small in comparison to other countries. In the US and in the UK, billions in fines have been demanded from because of criminal activities in banks and other institutions. In Germany, we haven't seen fines that relate in anyhow to the importance of the misdoings. And then there is something that I would call a German hubris. Peter Altmaier, the economic minister, said, I quote him indirectly, I would have expected that kind of scandal anywhere but in Germany. And this, after a series of financial fraud scandals in Germany, this after Cum-Ex, this after the failure of Landesbanken, and all what we have seen in the last 16 years in Germany, shows that the economic minister has no idea what's going on in the financial sector in Germany. And that his mindset is the problems lie in Spain, in Italy, in the UK, in the US, everywhere else, but in Germany, everything is fine. And we know from the facts that Germany is an El Dorado for money laundering, but it's not realized as an important question of financial and economic policy to clean up the German financial sector. And so the difference, the gap between what's going on and what public those responsible for the policy making realize as being the situation is so enormous. My second point, I want to answer to your Kukies concerning the question of independence of BaFin. I think the main point I want to raise is we want to make supervisors serve citizens and not banks and political interests. And this is the paradigm change that is needed. And what you can see in the last reforms in the UK and the US is that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in the United States is proud of serving the citizen. You look at what they publish, they say, well, we fought back in the interest of citizens against some misdoing in the sector, and we could recover the money for the citizens. You have never seen such a picture of BaFin presenting itself as someone who acts in the interest of citizens. Same in the UK, where what the UK Financial Conduct Authority publishes, they see themselves and present themselves as serving the citizen and not the public interest. So I think it's the question is, how do we get that paradigm change about? And I do concede that the first response has been quick, but it hasn't included a real analysis of the wrong paradigm. But the statements in the political response at first were, everything done by the institutions in Germany has been okay, but a fraud can always happen. And if this is the main explanation that the government gives, that shows me that there is no credibility for a real paradigm change.
Okay. Yeah, I have a question to Jörg, actually. One of your key arguments was, well, we're running out of time in this parliament, and there are some complex issues that we can't basically get done before the election. My question is a bit nasty, maybe, but I mean, why didn't you start earlier? Weren't you aware of these problems before the Wirecard scandal broke, or didn't you put the political priorities to them? I mean, you could have started in 2018 after the coalition began. I think you need to unmute yourself.
I think the answer to that point is pretty simple. I mean, there's simply this question of BaFin independence was really brought to the forefront through the Wirecard scandal. I agree with Martin Hellwig that, of course, that debate was had after the financial crisis, but all of the regulatory reforms that were done afterwards were implemented, right? So the debate around independence is a further strengthening of independence of BaFin, a good thing or needed, has really come up through the Wirecard scandal. And by the way, I fully appreciate Gerhard Schick's point, right? I mean, of course, the initial response that you have when a scandal like that pops up is to be defensive. And if we had known the enormous amount of wrongdoing and mistakes that happened and things that went wrong on the 25th of June, yes, our response would have been different. But, and I'm endlessly gracious, even though, as I said, the process has been painful, but I'm very, very gracious to the parliamentary committee because it brought to the forefront so many things that would have remained undetected. So in that sense, it also helped our learning, and it helped us to, through learning more about the causes and the depth of the scandal, and to rally support for the reforms that we're doing, which I don't think would have happened if this parliamentary inquiry committee hadn't done its work. So I think that's a process of learning and understanding through the evolution of information that was uncovered that I claim for myself, just like anyone else who's learning and adopting reactions. And I said that in my statement in front of the parliamentary committee. For example, we completely underestimated the problem of Wirecard stock trading in the supervisory bodies. I fully agree. We didn't have that on our radar screen. We had a 2018 report by the ECB saying that the German supervisory authorities, especially BaFin, is fully compliant with the European standards on compliance. But what kind of proprietary trading activity was possible below that radar screen, we simply didn't know because we didn't have the data, we didn't have the information. So the fact that Daniel Bayas asked us in the parliamentary questioning, we initially completely underestimated that. I completely acknowledged that. And I said that in front of the committee, and we learned, and we then took the consequences and said, okay, we're gonna do what is necessary, namely prohibit employee trading by supervisory bodies. And you can say, of course, that should have been done much earlier, but you have to detect a problem before solving it, right? So in that sense, of course, I fully agree with you. We should have known much more. We could have maybe known much more, but when we found out the information, we definitely reacted as quickly as we could. And I think with now the fact that the finance ministry is also implementing prohibition on trading by employees of the ministry is also something that we're doing as a first. Not very many ministries have that, and the BaFin now I think is one of the leading supervisory bodies on the depth of prohibition on trading that on stocks that are being directly, and I think that's important, indirectly supervised. So I think we're doing what we can, and we are trying to take the lessons learned from this very, very seriously. One of the things that I want to say to Daniela, if I may, I think one of the points that you're making simply suffers from the fact that it's not true. You mentioned Deutsche Bank, Commerzbank as a prime example of supervisory helping of national champions. And I can only repeat what I've said millions and millions of times. This was not an idea that the finance ministry had. The chief executive officers of Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank came to us and said, this is something that we want to consider. We don't know if we want to do it, but we want to go to the stage of an ad hoc statement. We want to evaluate whether a merger makes sense. My personal response was, there is one gentleman, he sits in Frankfurt, but he's Italian, whose voice I will hear very carefully to evaluate whether it has merit, and that is Andrea Enria, the boss of the single supervisory mechanism. So if you agree from a business perspective to do it, then the supervisor will tell us whether it is sensible to do it from a public policy interest or not. But all of this talk about championing and pushing this forward. And by the way, both CEOs now have said repeatedly that there was no pressure from Berlin for the two of them to merge. So I'm happy that you mentioned this, because it gives me the opportunity to once again say this in public, but I just want to set the record straight on that point.
Yeah, I would also come back to this national champion argument. I mean, I was also for a very long time very critical of this notion that we need national champions in banking, as I always thought, well, I mean, the origin of an investment bank doesn't really matter. I mean, they want to make business, making money isn't a patriotic duty. And I was always skeptical about these studies arguing, well, if you look at a financial crisis, banks have this tendency to retreat to their home country. And then last year, when the pandemic started, like after like 3-4 weeks, we heard from many German corporates and also from the banking sector that quite a few American banks were really hesitating to take part in these emergency loan packages. And we did a big front page story saying, well, the American banks are pursuing kind of an American first strategy, which quite a few people, I mean, I can't review my sources here, but this wasn't kind of a lobbying piece which was planted at us by some banks, but we did a lot of reporting to get this nailed. So and that really made me think of and the other thing was that the domestic banks were much more eager to take part in these programs. So that really made me think, well, if this argument, we need some kind of, well, maybe not national champions, but powerful banks based in under our own jurisdiction, it might actually be an economic necessity, because otherwise you'll be left out in the cold in a crisis. What's your view on that, Daniela?
Well, thank you. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And the point about national champions that I think is important to repeat and to make is that the idea of national champions, at least for the past 20 years, has been national champions, European-based or German-based national champions that can compete against the US in the ways in the US-led financial globalization, in market-based finance, in capital and derivatives markets, in wholesale funding, not in providing local funding to local corporations. That's a very different kind of argument and a very different kind of paradigm of organizing the financial system. And I would fully agree with that. Even to my mind, some of the efforts in Brussels to reform European finance were along those lines of trying to sort of size down a bit the market activities of European banks and to try to promote as much the sort of traditional on-balance sheet lending to corporations. So it's not impossible to have national champions, and it's important to have good banks that are lending to your local corporations, particularly if you want to have a low carbon transition, but it's not the same thing as arguing that you need national champions that can compete with US investment banks or with US hedge funds or with US or with BlackRock. And I'm very happy to hear from Jörg, if I may, that I think there is a question of nuance there, and maybe the Financial Times was misreporting then, but I can show you 3 or 4 quotes or articles that were, and not only Financial Times, but Bloomberg as well, that suggested there was a political appetite for the merger, and that political appetite might not mean or translate into political pressure on the CEOs of those banks, but certainly there is that was my understanding. And if you want to clarify that there was also no political appetite, and the entire conversation was, well, this is something that is decided in Frankfurt by European regulators, and it's fine with me. I have my questions. Also, knowing, for example, the conversations on Capital Markets Union and STS securitization, where I have seen various German MEPs berating small European cooperative banks because they cannot become they didn't want to support securitization initiatives, for example, because they will not be able to compete in the globalized financial system. So I'm not that entirely persuaded that the German regulators are not, at least on some level, or German politicians are not on some level still committed to the idea of national champions that can compete with US investment banks and US asset managers.
Can I?
Sorry, go ahead, Martin.
In support of your case, the fact that we didn't have as much of a credit crunch in 2009 was due to the prominence of local savings banks and local cooperative banks in retail. They were not directly hit by the financial crisis, and that did much to soften the problem. Counterexample, in 91, 92, it was the derivatives business of the major Swiss banks that enabled them to continue domestic lending despite the crisis in the Swiss economy. So the economics of this is very complicated. But if you think about the examples that I've given, special purpose vehicles, closing your eyes before non-performing loans and so on, those are examples where supervisory practices subvert internationally established rules. And at some level, the German political and supervisory committee has wanted to have its cake and eat it too, namely to have well-defined international rules, but then to go home and find ways or tolerate ways of subverting these rules. And that's a problem.
Thanks. I think there's one topic which none of you has looked upon so far, which I think is really relevant, and it's a kind of one of the takeaways of my personal takeaways of 18 months of Wirecard reporting in this broader context, which is, I think we need a real change in how financial regulators and criminal authorities, prosecutors, work with each other, because basically until my apart from the short selling ban and the criminal complaint against my colleagues, my perception was that we really had a finger pointing between criminal prosecutors in Munich and BaFin, both basically saying, oh, we don't have the authority, we don't have the legal means in really investigating this. And I mean, the fact that this criminal law enforcement is decentralized and run by regional prosecutors, which quite often don't have the expertise and the resources to look at these super complex cases of potential criminal fraud, I think is a big obstacle in under the German system. And I personally think what the country needs is some kind of federal financial crime authority, which has kind of the manpower, the resources, the data ninjas to really look at these kind of complex frauds. And I would be really keen in Jörg's view on that issue. Is this something you've thought about, which would be politically feasible, and why isn't this kind of done in a different way?
Okay, first of all, of course, you go straight to the heart of the German constitutional setup, right? Because as you know, law enforcement and the setting up of state prosecutors is a very well-guarded and important authority of the regions, right? So in that sense, that's a constant debate. I do think what we've seen recently in some of the federal states on the prosecution of the Cum-Ex scandal speaks a bit against your theory, because if the states want to engage in very targeted and very thorough prosecution of financial crimes, as the the court cases in Wiesbaden and Bonn, and the activity of some of the regional experts there show, if there is a will, there is a way. So in that sense, I do think it's hard to see that that the prosecutors are sort of restrained from doing their work. And as you could observe, once the BaFin filed a complaint in early June 2020, prosecutors raided Wirecard's office 2 days later. Right? So I think it's possible. I think the mentality has to change, and I completely agree on that one. And I said that publicly, that this unbalanced prosecution of your colleagues, which I deeply regret and I apologize for, as you know, versus the very late action that was taken in terms of criminal liabilities against Wirecard, I think is of course is something that needs to be changed. We're doing that legislatively by giving the BaFin the authority now to file complaints much earlier and directly due to accounting fraud. I think that's extremely important, that BaFin has the right, but also the obligation to do that directly without delegating it to someone else, and with the proper authorization of searching premises, filing affidavits, and going much deeper into the sort of prosecution itself. So I think we're addressing all of those things. The other thing that we need to change, and one of the things that that BaFin has to do in addition to working with the prosecution authorities, is working with critical voices. I think that's one of the things that became very clear, that there was no interaction between BaFin and critical analysts, critical journalists, short sellers, and all of those who could have provided information much earlier. And we're setting up a market contact group under the direct responsibility of the incoming BaFin president, Mark Branson, to do nothing else all day long, but to talk to critical voices, be they civil society, be they journalists, be they analysts, be they short sellers, doesn't matter. They will have only the job of reaching out and taking in information from critical voices. And I think that's extremely important as one of the things that will bring forward culture change. And believe me, Mark Branson is someone who has proven that he is very tough on this aspect and is willing to do it.
Martin in the chat mentioned a book, The Chicken Shit Club by Jesse Eisinger, who which we should read on criminal prosecution. Could you maybe elaborate what's the point of this book and what's your view on this broader topic also?
The US does have a certain tradition in criminal prosecution connected with financial scandals. It's not always a happy one. In the wake of the Enron scandal, there were a number of condemnations, and some of the most important ones were overturned by the Supreme Court. The Eisinger book is about the lack of criminal prosecution after 2008, which he documents in great detail. And the Chicken Shit Club is, of course, just a label for cowardly people in responsibility. Now, one feature about this, which I learned from a law colleague when I asked for greater liability of executives in 2008, he told me, it's all in the books, except you don't get it through the courts, because when the stuff comes to the courts, the people in charge will say these were just ordinary business risks, and you certainly don't want to penalize someone for taking ordinary business risks. And they will adduce a whole lot of legal expertises by law colleagues, renowned law colleagues from academia, to which my reaction was, so the difference in abilities to pay for legal expertises has an influence on legal practice? And the answer was yes.
Yeah, I think we have 2 minutes left. Gerd, do you have a view on the criminal prosecution and issue? And the question is if maybe BaFin or someone else should get even more power with this regard?
I'm very glad you raised the issue, because I think this is something where we need a new paradigm over the different levels of parliament. And I would challenge a little bit the view of your Kukies concerning the Cum-Ex investigations. The Federal Finance Ministry was completely aware of what's going on in Cum-Ex in 2009. Criminal investigations started in 2013. We talk about over 1,000 persons inflicted in the scandal, and investigations started with one attorney, one sole person. I mean, it's so late that we are running out of time all the time, and laws have been changed to extend the period in which attorneys can work on those issues. And there have been years lost because the institutions in Germany were not picking up the issue, were passing it around from one attorney to the next. Why has the state of Hamburg never started an investigation, although the HSH Nordbank, the bank, gave them a full report showing all the details of the Cum-Ex deals done in that bank? And the state attorney of Hamburg didn't pick it up, but passed it on to the next and to the next. So I think Cologne is the case of a rare exception of a criminal investigation that normally in all the other cases didn't work. So it's exception to the rule. And we have to make sure that we change that in Germany. I'm in favor of thinking of an SEC-like institution where the financial competence, financial market competence, and the investigative authority come together. And I think we need that either at a European level or at least at the federal level in Germany. And what was mentioned that the courts to play a role here, and there is a lack of competence in the judicial system. I think we have to focus on that side too. Also talking about the influence of the financial lobby on what's going on in the legal system. I mean, who writes the papers defining the legal opinion? It's basically those legal enterprises like Freshfields who have the time and the resources to build the leading legal opinion on these issues. And Cum-Ex is a case where you can see that those who did the criminal acts had the money to pay experts to write down their legal view on it. On the other side were weak government institutions who reacted too late. So I think there's a huge task for the next government to work on that. And it's not only a federal question there, I do agree, but I think we have to realize that that might be a weakness of our federal system, that when it comes to global financial crime, like in the case of Wirecard, maybe the regional authority for Lower Bavaria is not the best in charge to control money laundering issues of such a big enterprise.
All right, I think we could continue for at least the full day, probably even the whole week, on separate issues which we talked about. Unfortunately, we don't have this time, and I don't want to ruin your time frame, Thomas. So thank you to all of the panelists for this really interesting discussion. Apologies to some people who posed questions in the chat, which I thought were slightly too technical and would kind of get us off track. Yeah, thanks for having this really interesting discussion, and let's hope that some political conclusions will be drawn.